for coming today. We have Jeanne Blasberg, who is a novelist, travel writer, and adventurer. Her debut novel was Eden, and it was the winner of the Beverly Hills Book Awards for Women's Fiction, and a finalist for the Benjamin Franklin Award for Best New Voice in Fiction, and Sarton's Women's Book Award for Historical Fiction. Her newest novel, The Nine, was released by She Writes Press in August 2018. Welcome, Jeanne.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks to the library, the Randall Library, for having me, and to the Silver Unicorn Bookstore for your support as well. Indie authors and indie bookstores have a special relationship, so I really appreciate it. And thanks for coming today. I'm so excited about this book. It's provoked a lot of conversation. As I've traveled around the last few, months now talking about it, there's several ways that I've spoken about the book. The first is that it's a suspenseful page-turner set on a boarding school campus and really peppered with anecdotes from my years as a boarding school mom. So I have 3 children now in their 20s. They went to 3 different boarding schools in New England. My husband went to a 4th boarding school. And I'm the product of a big public high school in Southern California. So my eyes were wide open at their stories and their experiences, most specifically my children's experiences. But I think there's some good color in the setting here. The second way I talk about the book is that, unfortunately, it's a novel of our times, where parenting has taken on a very intense aspect. There's helicopter parenting, snowplow parenting, competitive parenting. There's a very strong maternal point of view in this book, and it's kind of takes on the zeitgeist of our time, where parents have even gone that extra unfortunate step, and the Varsity Blues scandals and kind of crazy things like that have started appearing in the news. So some people have said, "Oh, did you start writing the book after Varsity Blues broke?" And I'm like, no, because that was only 6 months ago. The book was well in the can, as they might say in Hollywood, before Varsity Blues. But I think it's been that the possibility of such misconduct has been in the air for a while. In addition, the stories that you all may be aware of, I mean, you're probably obviously aware of, but we saw them most prevalently in the Boston area, the Boston Globe's exposure of sexual misconduct on our most illustrious secondary school campuses. And there just seemed like a period where no one school or campus came off scot-free. And so this era of scandal and cover-up is another thing that colors the narrative and actually is part of the plot. The third way I talk about the book, and this is very similar to what I did with my first novel, Eden, where I made allusions to Genesis. In The Nine, I'm trying to create a modern retelling of the Hannah and Samuel story in the book of Samuel. So in the Bible, or the Old Testament, Hannah is desperate for a son. She's infertile. Her husband, or she's barren, as they would have said in the Old Testament. Her husband has other wives who have lots of children, and she prays and prays for a child, a son specifically, and in the process vows to God that if she were to become pregnant, she would turn this child over to the temple and the priest as soon as he was weaned. And so my Hannah hands a child over when he's weaned, and I take liberties with that definition because Sam is now 14. But she hands him over not to a temple and a priest, but to an academy and a headmaster. And I'm making the parallel with really just that moment of letting go and the faith a person has to have in the world, that their offspring are ultimately going to end up in good and safe places. And it's a moment of vulnerability and a difficult moment. When I was studying the story in the Old Testament, Hannah's voice was largely absent. What her emotion was at that moment of letting go wasn't part of the biblical story. And so I started to kind of fill in what might be in her head. And it was at this time that I was letting my own kids go. So that story really had a big impact and inspiration behind the writing of the book. I mentioned my first novel, Eden, which, by the way, quite surprisingly, some people didn't realize it had a biblical allusion until I'd mention it, and I'd say, hey, didn't the title kind of give it away? But that is a book that is only similar in a few regards, but very different in that it's a 100-year timeline. It's historical fiction. It's a family saga. It's kind of a sweeping story of 4 generations. And as my debut novel, I was working on this for over a decade. And at different points got the feedback that it was quite ambitious. So I started on it in about 2008, 2009. I put it aside at one point, feeling really overwhelmed by all the rewriting it was going to require. And that's when I started writing this, and it was about 2013. It was, like I said, a moment where my kids were experiencing high school or just beyond high school. Stories were coming out in the news. And I had been studying this story in my Torah study. Now, so that's basically, it took me 6 years to write the book. And you don't sit down and write a book or work on anything for 6 years, or even over 10. For pure entertainment value, I mean, I hoped that I was writing things that would have some meaning and would add to the global conversation, the conversation around something that I felt I knew something about. And in this case, it's parenting, and specifically the expectations we put on our kids and that they carry around. And I've been so troubled by the almost, it's not unfamiliar to anybody, but the epidemic of anxiety that our kids have felt. And it's, things have ratcheted up. I alluded to the fact that I mothered during these times, and I was witness to not only what my friends and peers were talking about, but how I felt myself as a mom. And I am completely authentic and honest in saying I am not Hannah, but there's a little bit of Hannah in me, and a lot of my friends admit that so she's a difficult character to read because we all recognize an occasional thing we might have done, said, or thought in Hannah. So the bigger meaning, I hope, is that moms and kids, moms and teens, moms and moms book clubs, I don't know, people read this book together and start some greater conversation. How does a work of fiction kind of address a bigger societal issue? And I think it is because they are make-believe stories with make-believe characters, and it's easy to talk about these people and what they're experiencing. It's much easier than talking about maybe what our neighbor is experiencing or something, and it can always serve to be kind of a metaphor. But Hannah is a good person, but she is a driven person. And why is she so driven? She wants more for her son. She wants more for Samuel. She wants him to have great opportunities. But I think it becomes fairly visible to the reader that Hannah wanted more for herself. She wants her son's brains and admission to this amazing school to kind of equate to upward mobility for her family, and also maybe be a badge of success on her parenting. Like, you got him there, you get an A+. So this is kind of where she's coming from. We're capturing her in this 4-year period where she's letting her son go and things aren't working out the way she had planned. And Hannah's the type of person who is very stubborn and is pretty insistent on the way things were the way she had planned things for the past 16 years. So she's a little frustrating because it's like she's trying to push a square peg into a round hole at certain points. But there is, I'm not going to give anything away, there is, I think, the satisfaction that Hannah transforms. So I mentioned that this is kind of a page turner. It's got a crime that's committed and Sam is really obsessed with solving the crime. But in the end, after I wrote several drafts and tried to kind of create something with a lot more action than I was told Eden never had, I realized, if action is fun and it keeps you turning the page, and I'm glad I had such a compelling setting and plot, but what I was really interested in doing was exposing the evolution of this relationship. And so all of that fun suspense is like a scaffolding, but over it I have draped the emotional struggle between, not just between a mom and a son, but this whole small family of 3 experiences. And I think as a writer, that's what I really like to do. I feel like that's what I'm good at doing. And if you enjoy that kind of familial exploration, you will love Eden, which is 4 generations of it. So besides Hannah, there are 2 other points of view characters. And talking about it from the writing point of view, I played around with structure a lot. I wrote Hannah in the first person, primarily because of the way I just described her. She is a loner, not a lot of friends, in her head much of the time. Her marriage is spiraling downward, and her son and companion is now off onto a new stage of life. So Hannah, I really I wanted to capture the time she's alone, and really the best way to capture what she's going through is by writing her in the first person. The entire rest of the book is written in the close third, and the 2 point of view characters, in addition to Hannah, are Sam, and then a 25-year-old hockey coach named Sean Willis, who is the dorm parent of Sam's dorm. He's 25 years old, and it's also his first year at the school. He is in charge of 65 teenage boys, and he is way in over his head, or in way over his head. He meets Hannah and Sam on drop-off day, and Hannah, as you can imagine, wasn't expecting him to be the surrogate parent. Mm-hmm. And so that's when her disappointment in loco parentis contract kind of begins. She had a pang in her gut at that moment, but she continues pushing on with the plan. So Sean was an interesting character to choose as a point of view character to have such an important role. I really needed a member of the faculty to have a speaking role in this novel, because stuff happens that neither Sam nor his mother would have any access to or know anything about, and so I need to have that insider's view on faculty. But he's not really an insider yet. He's an outsider trying to fit in, and in that way he parallels Sam's and Hannah's experience. So as a writer, I like to write about these places of privilege, these moments of privilege, but from an outsider's point of view. So Sam's family is from a upper middle class family. His father, makes a living that they can barely afford this tuition, but they have enough assets so that they don't qualify for financial aid. So they are like caught in the middle there, where they're like pretty strapped to do this, and Sam's well aware of the sacrifice his parents are making. And he runs into a world of legacy and privilege, and there's this opportunity now that I have to editorialize on it a little bit. Dunning Academy, the school I've created, is over 100 years old and was created for the most elite young men of New England, and in the 80s and 90s becomes co-ed and develops a need-blind admissions philosophy, so that all of a sudden there are groups of people and diversity on this campus. However, just like I described my scaffolding and draping the evolution of a relationship, the scaffolding of the school didn't quite accommodate all the diversity that it was accepting. And so you find yourself in this novel in a Dunning Academy. Picture a large kind of 1,200 student campus where there's lots of factions. And so the 9 refers to a secret society that Sam finds himself in, but Sean finds himself in the correlating type of faculty fraternity, or there's just lots of groups. And so one thing that's interesting to explore is, whenever you're writing a campus novel, which is basically a microcosm, it's, there's the ideal and then there's the way things actually happen. People cluster towards who they feel comfortable with. And so I liked commenting on that. I was recently on a panel at the Boston Book Festival on the campus novel, and I've written a little bit about it since that panel. I've always been drawn to this genre, but it's interesting to explore kind of in our era of like friendship, social media, constant photography and image taking, just the added pressures that that people and kids and these populations are facing. So I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think I've stayed pretty much on script. And so what I'd like to do at this point is read just a little bit of Hannah, and then I will explain a little bit more about the book and read a little bit about Sam. But does anyone have a question while I'm at this point? I don't want you to have to remember your questions for too long. Everyone's good? All right. So Hannah, as I mentioned, this is a first-person point of view. There is a prologue, but then we kick off with her in the first chapter, so it doesn't need a lot of context. But the thing I should say that this first chapter is Hannah now in retrospective, looking back at the whole high school experience. It's only a year or so out, so it's not like way out in the future, but she'll say that she handed Sam off 5 years prior. So it's as if he's now 19 and she's talking about this experience. The first time I heard Headmaster Williams speak the foreign phrase, I took it as a promise from one parent to another. Later, I'd learned it was the law. But on that very first day, when he touted in loco parentis as one of the Academy's primary responsibilities, I gave the man credit for understanding a mother's pain. Even though I turned Sam over to Dunning Academy 5 years prior, I recalled the headmaster's speech like it had happened yesterday. The way the Latin rolled off his Brahmin tongue, the way he pushed his round tortoiseshell glasses high on the bridge of his nose, and the way his tweed jacket stretched across the remnants of an athletic build. I see now how clinging to his every word was a little ridiculous. But back then, I craned my neck, peering above the crest-adorned podium to fully absorb his booming wisdom. That first afternoon in the Dunning Assembly Hall, I had been mesmerized by his charismatic Kennedy style, that toothy smile, his slicked-back dark hair, his wise expression welcoming us to some sort of Camelot. His assurances had allayed my fears as I stood at the sink over the next 3 years, hands submerged in sudsy water, my deepening worry lines reflected in the black and bay window. Although the thing I loved the most about my old simple kitchen was the door frame where I etched lines and penned dates chronicling Sam's growth over the years, I always remembered myself at that sink. Every Sunday evening I'd be scrubbing chicken drippings from a roasting pan and waiting for the phone to ring. You see, Sam conditioned us with well-spaced contact, our relationship hanging on a lifeline of weekly phone calls. I kidded myself they were enough, and what a laugh that would prove to be. I'd carry the phone past the space station model he'd left half-finished in the family room, so that Edward and I could talk to him on the speaker. I'd saved up so many topics for those calls and had needed, I realize now, so much in return. I'd needed Sam's happy voice to confirm that Dunning Academy had been the right decision. So you get a little sense of Hannah's retrospective voice, a little bit of regret over how she had behaved or how she had approached it all. And then the second chapter, you're right back in Sam's early years of high school, and then things start rolling. As I mentioned, Sean is the second point of view character. And a funny thing about Sean is that when I started writing him, I had intended him to be one of the villains in the novel. He was modeled after a person in real life who I really don't care for. And this was going to be my chance to show why. Anyway, writing and rewriting the chapters, it's one of those instances where some people have asked me, do the characters kind of lead the way? And this was one of those times that really did happen for me. He proved himself to be a nice guy, basically a kid himself, and I couldn't be angry with him. I found a lot of compassion for Sean. So I just like to talk about that as kind of a cool thing that sometimes happens when you're writing a character. It really dawns on you what their situation is, why they're behaving the way they are. And so a good number of my rewrites involved Sean's arc and his transformation. And so, that's all I'll really say about that. Sometimes I read a little bit from a Sean point of view chapter, but it might be a little bit repetitive over because of what I've already read. I guess I'd like to just skip to Sam, and he's the real hero of this novel. My 14-year-old, he starts off as 14. We watch his high school career. He survives an experience at a school that prides itself on being the most rigorous academically. So he survives that. He survives a 24/7 social life where things are Instagrammed and Snapchatted and Facebooked, and even more in this book that will be part of the things you discover as you read, but constant needing to be on. So a fishbowl, in a way, his social life is. And I think even if you're not in a boarding school, many of our teenagers are growing up in a fishbowl, because that whole essence of being photographed all the time is really what a fishbowl is. He survives those two things. He survives these extremely high standards his mother sets and these expectations, and he loves his parents and he wants to do well by his mother, and he's struggling with being his own person and willing his independence forth. So he survives that, and then he survives the discovery of a pretty terrible crime that's being committed on this campus, and decides early on that he's going to take on solving the crime because he's not really, he's not satisfied anybody else is going to do that. So all of those things, and this kid is still a great kid, and I really like him. I fell in love with him as I wrote him. He does get seduced by this group called the Nine. And I am going to read, I cut and pasted a few paragraphs that give you a good feel for why he would join such a group. After all, he is my hero, and the reader might wonder, well, if he's such a great guy, why is he joining this underground club? So he receives a note slipped under his door, and he rips the note to shreds. Before he ripped it to shreds, his eyes lingered on the word 9, penned in a bolder stroke. He'd always assumed that Max was full of it when it came to the ways of the secret society, but the possibility was now before him. His friend, this is Grabs, and I sometimes just say that and nobody who's Grabs. Grabs is his good friend. Grabs might have known what to make of it, but Sam worried somebody would be watching to see if he broke the confidence. Regardless of whether the invitation was real or not, he couldn't be seen as caring too much. An invitation to become part of the 9 typically gave rise to a little chest puffing and bravado. But Sam was different. Worrying the note and scavenger hunt might be another joke. The boys on their floor had been having fun at one another's expense all year. And the more he thought about it, the more this seemed like the type of stunt Max might pull. After all, Sam wasn't a legacy. He wasn't great with girls, and there were plenty of kids who were smarter. He had friends, but he wasn't popular. The only area in which he distinguished himself was on the robotics team, specifically by clinching the MIT Regional Championship back in April, for the first time in Dunning history. But Sam figured the robotics championship gave him more of a nerd status than any currency the 9 would value. Plus, if it was high-tech talent they were looking for, someone like Grabs would have been the obvious choice. But if the invitation addressed with his name and slanting script was for real, he was ripe for the picking. He hadn't expected Dunning to demoralize him so early and so often. When he performed well on his first 3 Spanish quizzes, he was reassigned to a harder section, where he struggled. The coach of the swim team was unimpressed with his efforts, and then there was his disgrace with Andrea. The 9 would be something of his own, something his parents, specifically his mother, would know nothing about. Attending boarding school had shown an uncomfortable light on how she'd carved herself into him, almost burying a weight he had to carry. Ever since she dropped him off, he'd been consumed by a perverse push and pull in their relationship, wanting her to feel his absence as poignantly as he felt hers. During their weekly calls, he held back on purpose, enjoying the edge in her voice. After their dinner at the burger restaurant, when she basically said he couldn't transfer out, he was determined to will his independence forth, to sever the millions of thread-like ties to her one by one. He imagined the 9 providing secretive, dangerous, Harry Potter-like thrills, and while Dunning wasn't exactly Hogwarts, it was similar enough. The 9 had the potential of becoming a true brotherhood, more so than the hodgepodge of first years he'd been thrown in with on the 4th floor of Wilburton. 6 of the 9 would be like big brothers, the perfect antidote to all those long, lonely years of only childhood. So off he goes. Any questions at this point?
Not a question exactly, but one of the things that just, in talking about Hannah as a character where you might, so it can be somewhat uncomfortable, or you can sort of see elements from, yourself or somebody else. There's just this whole part, kind of the helicopter-y parent part, but where she's really so clearly lost her own identity and is, pushing every other part of her life aside. And, not trying to get too detailed or give anything away, but realizing at the end that just sort of the contrast between her and Edward. And, that he's doing what he has to do, and we sort of come to discover that he has had other interests, but he's had to sort of put it aside for the sake of, you know, this dream she's had.
Yeah.
And sort of the way her driving all this has really impacted her family. It's just interesting to.
So, I mean, I made a choice. The father, Edward, isn't one of the main characters, and a lot of people question why he's taken that back seat to this woman. My three main characters are really Hannah and Sean and Sam. And Sean is the other parent in a lot of ways at this point in Sam's life. So Edward is, you know, in a family structure, when there's a really strong presence and then there's a bright light that everyone's focusing on, there's not usually three like dominant points to the triangle. Someone usually fades into the back. And Edward, the father, I think I paint him as fairly depressed. He's keeping up with the Joneses, doesn't like his job, beaten down, trying to pay the bills, and keep up this suburban facade that it doesn't really suit him, and he's decided. It is also, their marriage is, now that Sam's gone and the nest is empty, and Hannah had taken all of her focus on him, she's now seeing she hadn't been nurturing the relationship with her husband the way she should have, or the way a marriage needs to be nurtured. So, even though Edward is a minor character, I had to take a lot of care and thought with making it plausible that a man who had been to boarding school himself would really let his wife take over like that. He does have a good relationship with his son. It's a different relationship. It's a relationship of a lot of silent moments and tossing the ball, as opposed to moments where the mom is like present all the time. This man works hard and isn't present all the time, but loves his son so much. He just is also dealing with his own, I don't know, I think it's just clear. He's dealing with his own transformation and his own desire to be happier. And in the book, when he is happier, he is a better parent and he's a better partner. But even though he's a minor character, it took a long time to figure out what's going on with Edward that would really make him be like this and not be somebody you'd be disappointed or angry with for letting his wife take charge. So I hope I did that.
Well, and I mean, frankly, sometimes even when he is trying to push back or to not let her, she just does it anyway. So,
I know. When she wanted something, there was no stopping her.
right.
Yeah.
Even if it meant not being transparent about what she was doing. And just, doing it sort of
Every
secretly.
single character, you really have to go back to where did they come from and what are they in the middle of during this period from like 2010 to 2014. And so I see a lot of the way my parents are parenting as a reaction to the way they were parented. And I make fairly subtle allusions to that, maybe a few more with Hannah, but she was the oldest of 6. She was the built-in babysitter to younger siblings. Nobody asked her if she wanted to learn how to play the violin or take tennis lessons. She came from a very modest background, of working parents, and she was, her existence made it possible for them to work more because she looked after her younger siblings. And I think then she just had one child, she laser beam focused in on him. And I think she does things that are frustrating, but I hope people seem to understand why she's doing it. And so when you can understand why someone's doing it, you often develop some compassion for them. And with a little tongue-in-cheek humor, I had a friend tell me that it might be good if I start my book talks by saying that helicopter moms really get a bad rap. And the inspiration behind this book is that so people could understand why. But really, I mean, I laugh, but I think there is a generation of moms about my age, maybe mid 40s to early 60s, maybe I'm right in the sweet spot in my mid-50s, but I'm of the generation where, maybe one of the first generations, where I was told I could do anything I wanted. I could work full-time. I could stay home full-time. I could work full-time and stay home full-time. I don't know. I could raise my kids. I could have a career. And so when I made a decision to stay home and be a full-time mother, I think I decided it was a choice. It was either that or be a CEO of a company, you know, and I kind of took it on with the seriousness of a profession. And I think that a lot of people who made that decision, should I keep with my, you know, working? Should I do this? Once you decide I'm not going to work anymore, you almost have that insecurity that, well, if I'm going to stay home, my children are going to be perfect because this is what I've chosen to do. And therefore, any other alternative would not be good. So I will keep a binder on, you know, each one. We will have a big calendar on the kitchen wall, and we will manage our children like we manage projects. And so, again, I am being a little facetious, but I do think that that's what's fed some of this insanity, and people driving around with a sticker on the back of their car like it is their diploma or their badge of success. And it's kind of, I don't think in the 70s our parents drove around with stickers on the back of
The
their
sticker of the school?
Yeah. Yeah, like the pennant or the name of the school.
Yeah.
It's really a phenomenon, I think, of the 80s and 90s, right? Of like, ooh, we made it, we did it, we're awesome. People who don't even know us should know because we're putting it on the back of our car. So, you know, that's kind of the era in which my kids grew up.
You sent your kids to boarding school
Yeah.
from 14,
Mhm.
but you live in New England,
Mhm.
so was it like you lived in California?
Well, I have to say that we did move to Switzerland when my eldest was a junior in boarding school. And so living there, the younger two came with us, and the oldest stayed behind at his boarding school. And when we left, it was with the idea, oh, he'll come to Switzerland on vacations. This is a great family opportunity. We'll all travel when he's home on vacations. It's a 7-hour flight from Zurich to Logan. You know, it's basically, you know, like LA to whatever. We just justified it in a lot of different ways. And I did, the distance was a stressor that I had not banked on how much it would affect him. So ask your question, but know that I do have 3 years of experience of kids being really far away.
Yeah.
And a really bad time zone away too, for talking on the phone.
Yeah, right. Well, I was just wondering what, like you talk about her dropping him off and what that was like for you, sending your kids off. Maybe not so far for the young, maybe you came back or whatever, for the younger ones, but when they're only 14. And then, I haven't read the book yet, but, you know, obviously you think that was a good thing. And I wonder for you as a mother, what that was.
Yeah, so I wanted to first say that my kids had good experiences, excellent education, intense pressure. Everybody survived and was fine and okay. But I watched them go through things that I felt sad that they had to handle things by themselves, or that I found out after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I feel like if they had it to do all over again, they might make similar choices. And if it's something they really wanted, I would support it and try to be there for them. With our oldest, just like with the first time for anything, you don't really know what you're getting into. And I'm from a big public high school in Southern California, and I felt like I was handing over, it's not just you're handing over a child, you're willing to change your entire family dynamic for the sake of this education and sending them to a school. And when we did drop him off and the headmaster spoke to us, it was with those words, "Thank you so much for trusting Jack to us." And I took that to heart, only 4 years later to find out that a number of his teachers were pedophiles. So that was the betrayal that sparked me to write the book, and I kind of let go of the personal indignation at one point and was like, it's not about me, it's about like this archetypical story from the Bible, and it's a story of all mothers letting go and having that moment of faith. But what was that like for me, I think, is your question, and I think that's why I wrote the book and why I'm so drawn to the story of Hannah. Because in the book of Samuel, her voice and her aching is largely absent. And that's all I could imagine. Like, what else is the story about but this woman's aching because she wanted this child so badly, and then when he's weaned, he goes off. So between the prologue and that first chapter, I have a short quote from the book of Samuel where her husband is now going back to the temple to do their annual sacrifice in Shiloh, and he is saying, you should come with me, and we're all going back to Shiloh. That's where she prayed, and she said she would not go up. She said to her husband, when the child is weaned, I will bring him, for when he has appeared before the Lord, he must remain there for good. So, and that's all it says about what she could potentially be missing. And so that moment obviously reverberated inside of me, therefore, thus inspiring me to write a book. 14 years, if you have children, is long, but it's just gone that minute your car pulls away and all their stuff is in this room, and you realize so much of like who they become as a person and their friends, and everything is now going to be apart from you. So that's a realization that I don't think you're completely prepared for until you start driving home and it dawns on you. And so, as Jael mentioned earlier, Hannah's rendered herself obsolete and is now suffering an identity crisis. And if I didn't have my writing and all the things, I did other things besides raise my kids too, but I don't know, I just really, really felt this character strongly, and it was when she felt like her trust had been betrayed, and this headmaster and this place hadn't lived up to their side of the bargain. That was a pretty bitter pill to take. Yeah. But you can tell, not only did my oldest son go away to school, my middle child went away, my youngest child went away. I think after the first son's experience, though, I took off the rose-colored glasses. I wasn't drinking the Kool-Aid quite as often.
So did you explore those possibilities for your kids' education more differently than
Cynically,
the first one?
maybe. Yeah, so the other two went to smaller campuses. At first, I really wanted all my children to go to the same school that Jack went to. Jack's the oldest. And then realized, what, they should just, if they're not going to be home, they can go to whatever school is the best for them. I thought maybe there'd be some comfort in being together as siblings. But each of them pushed for slightly different things. One wanted a strong music program, one wanted a different experience. So I really respect the way that they went about choosing their schools. And we're Jewish, and so I found myself in a bit of a dilemma, because when your child turns 13 and they become a bar or bat mitzvah that's filled with all sorts of pride and conversation around how capable they are, how they are independent souls, how they are young adults in charge of their own destiny. And so then when they tell you they want to go away to school, you can't quite say, never mind, you're actually not. You should actually stay in your bedroom until you're 21. So I found myself feeling like, I gotta walk the walk. I just went on this whole thing, and so it was kid by kid with us. I don't. But even though it was kind of that heartbreak that most allowed me to get into the voice of Hannah, that heartbreak with my first child, there's bits and pieces of everybody's experience here in this book that that makes it colorful. So Dunning Academy isn't one school, it's a Frankenstein of different schools that I have personal experience with, and also schools we've just visited or my kids applied to, and we went to revisit day, or they played athletic competitions against, and things that I kind of anecdotally heard. And what do my kids think of the book? Because it is largely inspired by a moment in time that they can very recently recall. So they each reviewed the final manuscript and gave it their blessing. I got a few very important edits from them, in that I had subconsciously pulled names for some of the kids in the dorm that were actually real people that were there like, Mom, what are you doing? So changed some names, and otherwise I think what it did, it's an amazing thing. I think my kids felt like I really saw what they went through, and it was this amazing moment of feeling understood on their part, and me building a bridge. And so I think even readers can have those same conversations and moments with people in their lives. I really enjoyed putting this book in the hands of teens and parents and having them read it together. I had a boy read it who's 25, and he and his mom read it around the same time, and the tears and the letters back and forth they shared with me, that meant so much. And in the end, I mean, it isn't really, but I guess you could say that this is kind of an apology that I wrote that says I do understand what you went through, and it was hard, and I could have done better. But nobody's perfect, and we're all like trying to do a little better every day. So in the end, Hannah is trying to do better and does better, and Sam turns out perfectly fine. It's not how she had pictured it. But the lesson is that this is a journey, and it's not how we picture it that matters.
Definitely.
It's being here for each other. So
having been through that with my kids in school and all that, which JL has in her future. This is so interesting. Those decisions we make, they make, how different they are. Each child you choose very differently, and then you look back and you regret. And I just do it over. A lot of it, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Most people's life. I can't speak for other people.
No, I think I would have done things differently. I probably would have had Jack come to Switzerland with us, or gosh, this is on television, so I have to be careful what I say. But yeah, I mean, it's life. We all look back and think there are things we would have done differently. I think mothers heap that on hardest of all, because we think we have the ability to change the course of people's lives and greatly direct people in a certain way, and we do. And
but I think we have to remember that we did the best we can at the moment, that we did whatever it was,
with all the best intentions in our heart, and that's how we exactly.
I'm actually going to be starting a little book group at the place where we go in the winter, because the book group that's there is so bad. So I've already assembled my little group, and this is what the bear.
Oh, thank you.
Very
Well,
excited,
I would be happy to participate online or on Skype or
That would be
FaceTime.
awesome.
I do that often with remote book
They
clubs.
would love that.
Because the reason I wrote this book was if one, two, or a handful of people take their foot off the gas and just enjoy the present moment with these miracles who are our most beloved people in our families. They come from our bodies, or any type of family. It doesn't even matter if there's a biological connection. But it's just don't trade that for making somebody study harder for the SAT or something. It's like you look back and you're like, what? That was crazy. But you get crazy. Yeah, so if we can, I'd love to, and I'm trying to reach mothers groups and parenting groups, and in addition to book clubs.
Well, you're certainly right about the New England elite. In the olden days, the headmasters of Andover and Phillips Exeter and probably Groton, they would call, or probably write in those days, maybe call Harvard and Yale and say, So I'm just gonna give you the list right now of who will be going next year. I mean, it didn't apply, it was just, these are the people who are going to Harvard and Yale, Princeton and Dartmouth and wherever, which is kind of amazing when you think of it. That's how it was done. And that's how the elite continued.
And so I'd like to call out the institutional privilege here and how the whole legacy game is a hard one to eradicate. So yeah, I was questioned, like, you know, I come from a lot of privilege, and so why you? How can you, you know, if you're part of it, how can you write that book? And I'm like, who better than me? You know, because I was part of it, we did live it, and I want to show kind of what all of the hypocrisies and conflicts are. And I feel like I probably have more credibility than somebody who either is out to get them or has a serious, I don't know, just doesn't have the same relationship. So yeah, I do think it's a service. Well, the institutions aren't going away. If they can change and become better places with some self-awareness and reflection, then that would be good too. Yeah. Well, thank you guys. So this has been a nice, intimate group, and to those of you watching later digitally, thanks for joining as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.